Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Get to go after Neil, that guy. A great talk, and help set up some of the things I'm going to be talking about. You're going to see that we like to look at inventories, letters, that kind of thing to inform our study of material culture from the 18th century. This has been a wonderful program. Thanks to everyone here at the DAR. It's really fun to be here. My grandmother was a docent here, so I came as a very small person, but I don't remember. So I've just been so tickled to be here today and thinking about her. So today I will be talking about maps and prints in the 18th century Chesapeake home, dipping into the 19th century just a little bit, starting with an order to England. So you're familiar with that now, but not from Robert Beverley, but Robert Hart, another Virginia Robert. So in March 1771, Robert Hart, who was a merchant in Hanover, Virginia, having just taken unto himself a wife, was in want of a good many articles towards housekeeping. So he sent a long list. They did what newlyweds do. They went shopping. Though they didn't have crate and barrel at the time, their goods might have arrived in crates and barrels. So from England, because he wrote to London tobacco merchants, Norton and Sons, to purchase said articles. And Neil has set that up very nicely for me. They're buying on credit from these merchants. That's where their capital was tied up. I'm not going to read the entire 3-page order, quite an extensive order that included things like tableware, such as a fashionable tea equipage, 2 japanned tea boards, a mahogany tea chest, or furnishings like 6 mirrors for their house. He also ordered personal adornments for his wife, like a piece of fashionable flowered silk, dozens of necklaces, and 1 dozen sprigs for ladies' hair, and so much more. Sprigs like you see in the hair of Mrs. Purdy here. High on his list, however, was a large and specific order for maps and prints that you can see on the screen. The order included 3 or 4 dozen of the most fashionable pictures for rooms in plain frames with glasses and without gilding, so meaning they had glass and they're just in a simple frame, like the one you see here. A set of the best geographical maps without frames or staffs, value about 30 or 40 shillings. So maps not framed and not on rollers, which I'll show in a little bit how those were used. 3 dozen mezzotint prints without frames or glasses, so just the prints themselves. And a small camera obscura with 3 or 4 dozen perspective prints without frames, mostly colored, and different views from the above glazed ones. So these were views or landscape images meant to be viewed through an optical device known as a camera obscura. Mr. Hart understood that prints and maps were important decorative and social furnishings that would make his home well equipped for entertaining his peers, customers, and to keep up with the latest fashions. So today, as we ponder the world of consumerism in the 18th century, 19th century, I'd like to you to take a moment to ponder with me the world of paper in the 18th and early 19th century, the paper that Marylanders and Virginians used to decorate their homes during this time period. I will be talking today about how prints and maps were used as furnishing in the 18th century Chesapeake and what this tells us about the tastes, aspirations, and consumption habits of their owners. First, I will talk about who owned prints and maps in the period as furnishings, looking in particular at the first half of the century. Next, where and how were these items displayed in the home, which leads us to what types of maps and prints were popular as furnishings. I'll also talk about a few rare survivals. As you can imagine, paper is very fragile, so few that were here in the 18th century survive, but some do. And then we'll take a brief visit to a case study in Baltimore from the early 19th century to look at that. This talk focuses on the Chesapeake in particular, roughly the area that is circled here on the map. This is mainly because it's easy to narrow in on a geographical area for things like this, but also it's the region that at Colonial Williamsburg, where I work, where we know best and have over many, many years gathered a lot of information that I'm drawing on. At Colonial Williamsburg, we began to collect prints and maps to furnish the historic area almost 100 years ago. But over time and through careful research, we've come to understand the types of things that were hanging on the walls and in what rooms. For example, in this photo taken around 1935 of the Raleigh Tavern, which is one of the first buildings that was reconstructed at Williamsburg, you see a map hanging over the fireplace. This map, which was made for the Marquis de Lafayette in 1781, was never really meant to hang over a fireplace. It's a manuscript map, meaning it's hand-drawn, and it was a military document, a working military document. But keep in mind, at the time, this was the display area. This was where these objects were put on display. Today, when this map does go in view, we have it in our modern art museum, and we use reproduction maps and prints in the historic area, but that's really just building on the knowledge of those who came before us. And in fact, they were using a lot of the same information that we use today when we're thinking about furnishing 18th century spaces. The photo also shows one of a set of 12 prints of the Caesars of Rome, and you can see that on the wall. And then I've highlighted one of the prints that we have. The reference to these prints comes from the reason that they put that print in the Raleigh Tavern, and we have some there today, is that because Anthony Hay, who was the proprietor of the tavern when he died in 1771, had 11 prints of Caesars listed on his inventory. We know that it was a set of 12, so at some point along the way he lost one. He had 11, and through some careful sleuthing, Margaret Pritchard, who is my boss, determined that based on their location in the inventory and their value on the inventory compared with other things and other inventories, that they were likely varnished. So a varnish was applied to the surface and probably tacked to the walls leading up the staircase based on where they appear in the inventory. So this is how they're interpreted now today using reproductions. We did not tack the 18th century prints to the wall, but this is to get a sense of where they might have been. Today at Williamsburg, our print collection is one of our most important resources. I'm biased, of course, but they do offer a unique window into the 18th century world. You might know, for instance, that someone had 6 chairs in their inventory, but how did they sit in them or use them? Or how did they not sit in them and use them? You can look at prints to get some of that information. And though the prints that I'm showing today depict English settings and interiors primarily, they're very useful for understanding the material world of the 18th century Chesapeake, because more than any other region during this time, residents of Maryland and Virginia were obsessed with emulating culture and fashions from England. So on to the first topic of who owned prints and maps during this period. It is important to note here that maps and prints were here in the 17th century, but like other luxury goods, they were really owned by the wealthiest individuals and in small numbers. So Niels laid this out, but we're just gonna go over it briefly. The system of selling tobacco on commission, which was established in the 1680s, changed the way that planters in the Chesapeake had access to goods from across the Atlantic. Overseas merchants would extend credit to planters to purchase goods by proxy, granting Chesapeake planters with access to a wider variety of metropolitan goods than they'd had before. At this same time, the map and print markets and sort of production were on the rise in England. At first, the English print market was centralized around imported European prints, but by the 1740s, with the increased demand for engravings and maps, for that matter, led to a full-blown domestic print publishing industry. This allowed customers at the lower end of the market greater access to these goods in terms of quality and quantity than they might have had previously. I'm going to start with an 18th century, sort of an outlier from Williamsburg, so John Custis IV, shown here, lived in Williamsburg in the 18th century, and he was kind of an exceptional owner of maps and prints for the time period. His probate inventory lists over 160 items that can be described as prints, maps, and paintings. So art objects. Sometimes it's a little vague on what things are, but that's a really stunning, staggering number. We know that he was, and this is, if you're familiar with Williamsburg a little bit, this is Custis Square. His house no longer stands. Our art museums are here. This is an older image. That parking lot area is now expanded part of our museum. And there are archaeological excavations going on at that site to discover what his garden looked like. He was had an incredible garden on that site. So we know that he was ordering prints from London by 1717, shortly after building his house. In 1717, he ordered for the passage, prints for the passage, and ever the tough customer, a little bit like Beverly, he was very specific. He said, let them be of the good sort or send none. He clarified what he meant by the good sort. He mentioned that he was a fan of a series called The Loves of the Gods, which he had received the previous summer. So he's basing this request on experience, telling them, I liked that. Can you send me more of that? This series was published in 1708. And as you can see, it features the gods and goddesses in love. We think it's a little risque, but these are fine engravings after Titian. So by having these in his house, he's demonstrating a knowledge of fine art and culture. And he was not interested in sort of what he called comical subjects. He wanted something serious, like this. He also discussed. He also was interested in quality, and in that he echoed his English peers. One wealthy Englishman wrote regarding furnishing his house in 1666 that pictures, if good, are very dear; if bad, they make the worst furniture that I can have. But good prints make as handsome a show. So what he means by pictures are paintings there. And so saying I can get something nice and comparable out of a good print. Custis, as I mentioned, represents kind of an outstanding case, but shows that what sort of the aspiration might have been for someone of his status. My pages are a little mixed up here. Okay. So in order to get a sense of who might have had prints and maps in this period, about 3 years ago, I started to conduct an informal survey of about 1,075 inventories taken between 1709 and 1750 from Kent County, Maryland. And I pulled out inventories that mentioned either a picture. So like I said, this could be a print or a painting. That makes it gets a little confusing sometimes. Prints and cartographic materials. I included atlases somewhat just because I was interested in gathering that information as well. And my preliminary findings were that only 46 out of the 1,075 inventories, that's 4.2%, mention wall graphics, which I guess was a kind of surprising, but it bears out in a way that I expected as well. So out of the 46 inventories, 87 mentioned only picture or print ownership, 9% owned maps alone, and 4% owned at least one of each. Overall, these inventories represented wealthy slaveholding propertied men, though six of the individuals were widows. By looking at the value of their inventories by total value of their property, and that is here. So looking at these, the total values of the property and kind of examining. So yeah, okay, so if we look at this data chronologically, you can see an increase over time. Inventories listing wall graphics, making a big jump in the 1740s with 20 individuals with a total estate values between 37 pounds and 2,700 pounds owning wall graphics. And this coincides with the print market and when it really took off in England and when more prints were exported to the colonies. So the 20 number there is at the end of my date range. And I suspect if we go into the 1750s and 60s, the numbers will only go up. It's important to remember, I think these slides just got switched. It's important to remember that people didn't live in a house didn't just live in a house with prints or maps, right? So as I was looking through the inventories, I got a little bit good at figuring out who might have prints or maps, as I'm scrolling through. And when I started to see things like the accumulation of other luxury goods, that pursuit of refinement, things like teawares, Japan furniture, gilded looking glasses, and books were an indicator that I should maybe take a second glass and look for the material that I was searching for. It's also important to note that these are luxury goods, so you can't eat paper. I mean, you could try. You can't sit on it. It won't keep you warm. So it's in the priority of the things that people needed to survive. It's a little bit low, although art is important. It's important to note those things. Newspapers in the region began to list advertisements for prints and maps during the 1730s. One interesting advertisement published in Annapolis in 1730 listed copperplate prints and also ordinary pictures, colored and plain. So that's an intriguing note there. Ordinary picture, what does that mean? Is it, they've said copperplate prints and ordinary pictures. So is it not a copperplate engraving? Maybe it's a cheaper alternative, like a woodcut or something like that. And so I think there are a lot of probably survivors that non-survivals that we'd consider ephemera on that lower end of the market that I'm always looking for information about, since it is these high style things that tend to survive. So another way of purchasing these objects was through the secondhand market. So you could be buying them directly from a shop or through the secondhand market. When John Custis's goods went to be auctioned off in Williamsburg in 1759, the majority of the wall graphics in the sale went to Williamsburg merchants John Greenhow and Graham Frank, who likely resold them in their stores in Williamsburg. So this takes us to the next topic. Where were these objects displayed in homes? Generally, we see both maps and prints in the most public spaces of the home, where they could be shown off. For example, in the hall, which eventually turns into the parlor, the space becomes known as the parlor. This is by far the most common location in inventories where a location is listed or it can be inferred. The next most common spaces were staircases and passages, which makes sense. You've got generally a lot of wall space in these areas, and they're more public areas of the house. This is followed by dining rooms and then chambers or bed chambers. There were also, there were some prescribed ways to decorate with maps and prints, and that sometimes they were advertised as such. So newspaper advertisements might mention that these are suitable for X location in a house. For example, in the 1730s, Edward Moseley's map of North Carolina was advertised in the Virginia Gazette as, quote, useful but ornamental for gentlemen's halls, parlors, or staircases. So we love to see those kinds of references, because it tells us that certain things were more appropriate for other areas than not. Maps were consciously displayed in spaces, often where men interacted, in order to show their enlightened owners knowledge of science, geography, geopolitics, and trade. Maps were useful geographic, cartographic objects, but in a domestic context, they could also be used for decorative purposes. Printed maps might be found in homes in various forms. And when I mentioned mounted on staffs earlier, the map above the fireplace here is mounted on staffs or rollers. It's basically the map is put onto linen, and then there are wooden rods that are holding it up. You can see another example of that in this print on the wall. So we have references to maps hanging in frames, but period images more frequently show them mounted in this manner. Small maps might have been framed and glazed or with glass protecting them, but due to the limitations in the size of glass, larger maps might still, they might still be in a frame. But if you think about a map that's about this big, they didn't have glass large enough to cover that, so mounting it on rollers like this made sense. In order to protect the paper, though, they sometimes would apply a varnish layer over the paper, but I'll get to that in a moment with a better example. And for non-decorative purposes, maps might be dissected, so cut into squares, mounted onto linen so that you could fold them up for better storage. You might have them in an atlas or just loose on a desk like this gentleman has in this painting. As I mentioned, prints were often referred to as pictures indiscriminately with paintings during the period. So when reading an inventory, it's sometimes possible to differentiate between a painting and a print based on the value, but it's not always the case. Generally, prints were offered a more inexpensive alternative to paintings, but prints could also be quite valuable, especially when they were framed with glass. Frame value could also go up when you add on expensive finishes like gilding. See in the painting on the left, she has a gilt-framed print behind her, and then the two prints that are at Shirley Plantation have gilt frames and are quite large. So that would add to their price as well. And then, of course, adding hand coloring watercolor to a print could also add the value. Just like I mentioned with maps, prints were also varnished. That's that alternative to glass. It offers a glass-like sheen while protecting the paper somewhat from the elements, things like bugs or to a small extent, water. And then they might be framed or tacked to the wall, or in this case, applied to a large board or panel. And a cheaper alternative would be to tack it directly to the wall or to paste something to the wall. And we see that in period sources from the time as well. Another problem with inventory research is that just because print or map isn't mentioned, isn't because the person might not have owned it, might not have been worth noting, cost-wise. But like wallpaper, once something is glued to the wall, objects are not listed because they're essentially valueless if they're immovable and can't be sold for profit. And finally, though not furnishing, prints were sometimes bound into books or kept in portfolios for safekeeping and viewing through an optical device, like Robert Hart was probably doing when he ordered a bunch of loose prints and prints for the camera obscura. Period images and physical evidence reveal that prints and maps were displayed in houses in ways that might surprise modern viewers. Images like those by William Hogarth also provide clues that prints and maps and paintings could be hung up quite high on walls during the period. I think sometimes Hogarth's doing this to tell a story he tells a story with every object in his prints. So you notice the framed objects along the ceiling of the wall. It's so we can see them, but it appears in other prints too that things are framed kind of above eye level, but it definitely varied. So what types of prints and maps were owned in the Chesapeake? What do we see over and over again? As prints became more available, their titles and makers are mentioned by name, and in inventories, we get a sense of what genres and artists and themes consumers were drawn to. We've already seen quite a few works by William Hogarth. They were extremely popular in the Chesapeake during his heyday in the 1740s through the end of the century. When lawyer and statesman Daniel Delaney of Annapolis died in 1753, his hall was decorated with Hogarth's Marriage a la mode, covered with glass, as well as one large map of America and 4 smaller maps. And Hogarth was one of the only artists that you see in inventories being referenced by name, so there was really name recognition associated with him. People who were at least taking the inventories had an idea of who that is, what that meant, and how much the value might be. Sets of prints were really popular, thematic sets. Some of the themes were things like the 4 seasons, the times of day, the arts, the elements, and the 12 months of the year, shown here represented by 12 fashionably dressed ladies. The genre of the 12 months was really popularized by Robert Ferber's 12 Months of Flowers, which was originally published in 1730. It was followed closely by their sequel, The Fruits of the Month, It sounds kind of like a club that you can be in. But these sets remained in high demand throughout the 18th century. They were extremely popular, the sets by Ferber themselves, and then the myriad of knockoffs that they generated, which caused quite a problem for engravers that originally made them. The only wall graphics that Martha Custis Washington took out of the estate of her father-in-law, so by her first marriage, was to the son of John Custis, who we've seen before. And they kind of famously or infamously, to some degree, had a difficult relationship. But out of all of those art objects listed, she only took sets of the fruits and flowers by Ferber. So though nearly 30 years old in the late 1750s, when she would have selected them or been offered them, something about them was enough to kind of negate this contempt for her deceased and cantankerous father-in-law. They were still quite fashionable objects. Portraits of famous individuals also made for suitable decoration. Let's go back. They also made for suitable decoration and might be used to show up political or religious affiliations. In the behind this, the sitters of this portrait are portraits of Queen Charlotte and King George, and I think in the corner there might be a portrait of Pitt, but it's hard to see in the corner. But I love this painting because it shows prints and landscapes side by side being incorporated together. So it's not just sort of here's the prints, but they're filling out the space on that wall, which is also something that they were interested in doing, was really not stacking them, but filling out the space. At the start of the Revolution, loyalist John Randolph of Tazewell Hall in Williamsburg owned prints of both the king and queen in his drawing room and his dining room. So he had them in two locations in his house, which is a little unusual, indicating to guests in both spaces where he stood at the moment. In about 1770, when his estate was tallied up, he had not died, but he was a loyalist. So they were accounting for his things to get money, basically, from there. So on the opposite side of this political spectrum at the moment, John Hepburn Sr. of Prince George County, Maryland's 1775 inventory listed two prints that were really hot off the presses when they were advertised in Virginia in 1766, so about 10 years earlier, prints of William Pitt and one picture of Lord Camden, who were both proud supporters of American rights. So he's demonstrating his ideas about England and taxation at this very pivotal moment. Another notable Marylander, Charles Carroll of Duddington's 1773 inventory, describes his map of Virginia by Peter Jefferson and Thomas Fry. It's listed in a frame, so it's likely that it wasn't glazed because it's a very large map. And so that's something that we can infer from that reference. In addition, also to regional maps in inventories, we also see maps of Europe and the world appearing in inventories, such as the four quarters of the world that they knew at the time, or how they referred to them at the time. So the maps of Asia, America, Africa, and Europe. As the century progressed, you see less and less of these and more regional maps, or just maps of the world at large. These international maps speak to the owners and their views of themselves as gentlemen who possessed a global worldview and also had interest in, as we talked about, global trade. Which brings us to the next chapter, example of prints that survive in Chesapeake collections. The reason that this talk is so heavily focused on documentary sources is because prints and maps have a pretty hard life here in this region and in general. Humidity, bugs, wars, redecorating, and most importantly, time have not been kind to fragile paper objects. The next few examples have history of surviving in Chesapeake collections, just including this scripture print, which has a history of ownership in Easton County, Maryland. And while it looks really terrible, I really love it. I think it's a very amazing survival. The print likely came from a house called Myrtle Grove, which was the home of the Goldsboro family. The house stayed in the family until about a decade ago, which is likely why the object was preserved. The set is based on paintings known as Raphael's cartoons. The Raphael's cartoons were a set of paintings that hung in Hampton Court, and they were published, prints of them were published from about the 17th century onwards. So this would have been something that Custis likely would have been interested in as well. This gives us an idea of how prints could be placed on canvas and then mounted on stretchers and placed in frames. So not just the paper in the frame, but in this example, you can see what I mean. The print, so there's canvas has been stretched over a stretcher and then pasted onto linen. So this would help with moisture, humidity, you don't get cockling, and it's also fitted into the frame. So it's going to support the print within the frame. It also is a good indication of satirical prints being hung up on the walls. Sometimes we think of, at least in studying them, that they might have been in portfolios. You're showing them off to your friends. But this print is documented at Shirley Plantation in Charles City, Virginia. Satirical prints like this survive in large numbers because they weren't typically framed during the period, and they don't typically show up in inventories. But this is a great example to let us know that they were indeed in some places. So never say never. Eyre Hall, shown here on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, has a relatively large number of prints from the 18th century. Severin Eyre's 1774 inventory is not very helpful, and when we're trying to figure out what kinds of prints were hanging in his house. It lists 13 large pictures, 1 dozen small, and 15 ditto. So not a lot to go on, there. But so fortunately, some of the prints survive from the 18th century in this house, including 6 horse prints, which could have originally been a set of 12. There's a set of 12 that exists sporadically through collections. These are actually kind of rare knockoffs of more popular horse prints, which made them a little bit difficult to track down, but I've put together 12 across the world. So they're actually housed in their original 18th century frames with sand-gilt liners, which is another great thing to see. They represent English thoroughbreds and their accomplishments and bloodlines. Something of great interest in the Chesapeake where hunting, horse racing, and horse breeding took off around mid-century with the importation of English horses for breeding. In fact, one of the prints, which shows a horse called Othello, it shows Othello, who was imported to Maryland by Deputy Governor Horatio Sharp in the late 1750s. Othello went on to stand stud here in the colonies for about 13 years based on newspaper accounts. And the Eyre family was very much engaged in horse breeding and had an English, I think, stallion in their stables. 4 of the larger prints are also views of parkland from estates in northern England, originally published in 1749 by Thomas Smith, though they remained in publication much longer. We see views of churches, landmarks, and great houses advertised in the region. So this was a popular subject matter for the time. Another set that survives are a set of 4 prints of Roman ruins, also another very popular subject matter for the time. The set itself is incredibly rare, originally published in 1745 by London artist and art dealer Arthur Pond after works by Panini. This set was also retailed in Boston by John Smibert, who was a painter, but also was a dealer in prints. He wrote to Arthur Pond in London and telling him to send him more of those Roman prints because, quote, they please hear more than ye others. So they were, it was very popular subject matter throughout the 18th century. The heirs were connections. The heirs were merchants with connections in England and London, so they probably purchased them directly from London, but the documents for that don't survive. This is a really remarkable image of the hall at Eyre Hall, so the front hall, and then a photograph from the late 19th century of that same room, and I've kind of split the screen in half. And if you look on just to the side of the door, you might be able to make out a horse print. So those small ones are likely above, and then those look like the landscape views. So just a really remarkable place and amazing collection to work with. Moving to after the American Revolution, it was out with the king and up with a new George to grace the walls of people's homes. In the early Republic, Americans looked inward, preferring to decorate with regional maps, views of North America, and portraits of their new heroes, and also scenes of what would kind of, even within 20, 30 years become historical events. Even George Washington felt the need to redecorate for the new Republic. Remember Ferber's Fruits and Flowers that Martha claimed from the Custis inventory. An inventory taken in 1800 after Washington's death listed 23 seasons listed in the attic. Seasons were also a way to refer to months of the year, or Ferber's flowers and fruits. This is likely the 2 sets minus 1 that Martha took from Custis's estate. They were taken down likely during an extensive redecorating campaign at Mount Vernon in the 1780s and 90s, and then placed in a storage area to gather dust until they were accounted for in the inventory. Washington redecorated rooms like his dining room with prints of American military victories, historical scenes like Penn's treaty with the Indians, and portraits of Lafayette and Benjamin Franklin. Prints that represented the values and tastes of the history and that demonstrated the history of a very new country. This speaking to that inward turn that I mentioned, these are choice subjects, things that appealed to them and an emerging identity. And now briefly, a case study into some Baltimore inventories. Some of the classics did remain the same in the 19th century, such as the Prince of Hogarth, for example. When her husband, merchant and financier Matthew Ridley, passed away suddenly at the age of 43 in 1789, Catherine Livingston Ridley, who was the daughter of the New Jersey governor, had to dispose of their, quote, large brick dwelling house and its contents on Hanover Street in Baltimore, which was equipped with a wharf, storehouses, counting houses, and other amenities. The contents of this home reflected his stature as a successful merchant and financier. The upstairs passage was described as elegant and spacious, meaning that you would have passed through a gallery of sorts because it contained sundry prints and pictures, large and small, including 3 large pictures. Turning into one of the 3 rooms, designated as a bedchamber, that listed 10 Hogarths. So he left the H off, but Hogarths and ship prints on the walls. Ship prints also graced the wall of the dining room parlor, a room that appears to have been just off the dining room, which was filled with furniture for taking tea and had 2 Hogarths prints on the walls. It's interesting to ponder the location of the prints by Hogarth, which is in a more private and likely feminine space, leaving the gallery-like and more public spaces for perhaps newer or finer things. So it's kind of working your way through what they're showing publicly and then what maybe was in a more private space with maybe older things or just beloved images. In fact, retailers were still selling Hogarth's prints. In 1794, this advertisement from Baltimore lists A Harlot's Progress, which was one of his sets. They're advertising it here in 1794. Several print sellers advertised other services, such as George Smith, who would carve and gild frames of prints to match others in the home, speaking to a level of refinement and specificity appropriate for this burgeoning city of merchants and a lot of wealth at the time. So this is a really kind of boutique specific sort of thing where you're thinking of really fitting out houses, not only kind of piecemeal, but as a whole. The home of Don Carlos Hall, who was a prosperous, free Black businessman, was richly furnished with painted furniture, Baltimore known for its painted furniture sets. His home had 11 gilt red-bottom chairs valued at $3.50 and a set of 12 cream-colored chairs at $3, but valued at $10. Among the most expensive things in this inventory are 16 gilt framed prints. No subjects listed, but that's very expensive for those objects. Counting among the most valuable possessions, they would have made quite an impact along with the assemblage of things in his house. And that's what's kind of difficult about talking about pulling these things out. You don't get a sense of what the full houses would have looked like. But this is a really nice inventory showing a lot of refined furnishings. Dr. Andrew Aiken was a particularly generous patron of local artists, and his inventory demonstrates how we saw in a painting earlier that paintings and prints could complement one another. It's worth noting here that 2 portraits were painted by African-American artist Joshua Johnson for Aiken, and his 1809 inventory does mention 6 portrait paintings. So these are 2 that are from of him and his family. Listed in a room that looks like a parlor based on context, lists 5 Guy's landscapes at $10 each and 5 prints at $1 each. By Guy's landscapes, he is referring to Francis Guy. Those paintings were considerably more expensive, but they're hanging in tandem with these printed objects as well, demonstrating these expressions of their wealth, status, and participation in the fashionable material world of the moment. So in conclusion, I hope this talk helped you picture the walls of the colonial Chesapeake home, as well as what these furnishings can tell us about the tastes, situations, aspirations, and consumption habits of their owners. And the next time you take a look in a period room or come visit us at Williamsburg, pay close attention to how typically reproduction prints are displayed, because each of them has a story to tell. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes.
Do you think that it's possible to tell if a print was historically framed by any kind of ghosting or foxing or any kind of condition changes?
So the question is if it's possible to tell if a print was framed historically, so meaning if it's the original frame or how it was framed from ghosting or foxing. You can tell, and the materials leave evidence on one another. So wood is the common backing board on paper, and wood and paper don't love each other long term. So you can tell, sometimes you can even see like a knot in the wood, sort of leaving a ghost on the back of a piece of paper. And then of course, some 20th century framing mat boards are notorious for leaving their mark on paper. Conservators have a keen eye for, art conservators have a keen eye for those kinds of things. It's amazing what they can kind of tell from what is left behind. But yeah, does that kind of answer the question? Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
No, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned Parlours Parlors. We have that hanging in a period room.
Oh, great.
And it can be, we'll show you. And it's, it can be fairly controversial.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, because they showed the slightly risque Roman gods, was there a sense of like propriety about these, like certain things considered inappropriate or subject to taste?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in the sort of like phrase and sort of morality, but you do see this Hogarth's images, let's say, very, very popular. They had a different sense of humor than we do today. And I think the types of physical jokes or kind of images of women's bodies being exploited or exposed make up pretty much the bulk of our, like the satirical prints that I was talking about. If you look at most of those prints, I think sometimes you think, oh, it's a beautiful woman and a man. It's usually a sex worker and a man. So that was a very popular subject matter. There were prints that, let's just say, were definitely X-rated and they were advertised and known of as such. So that might have been a little more taboo, but it's an interesting question about the line, because I know we have the loves of the gods in the governor's palace at Williamsburg because we know they were here in Williamsburg. And a teacher contacted us and said they were difficult for her students to see. And so having this conversation about, nudity and that kind of thing has been interesting. Art museums have that conversation too. But yeah, I don't know if that really answers, but those are sort of my thoughts. Yeah, sort of my thoughts. I think just
being blatantly advertised.
Yes, the sheer volume of the notes in the period, and then also the survivals indicate that they were very popular, like you said. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.